From the Chesapeake Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental reporting, this is Chesapeake Uncharted, the podcast that uncovers stories about the bay, its interconnected ecosystem, and the people who rely on it. I'm Jeremy Cox. On today's episode,
what put the final nail in the coffin for the Chesapeake shad fishery was Hurricane Agnes. I think it happened at the wrong time of year. The population just crashed after that and still hasn't recovered. We still can't have a shad fishery on the Chesapeake Bay 50 years after this storm.
I'm sitting across a desk from the person, whose job is knowing the history of fishing in the Chesapeake Bay.
I'm Pete Lesher, and I'm Chief Curator for the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum.
The museum complex is a doozy. There are 35 buildings, 10 housing exhibitions. Bring your walking shoes because it spreads out across 18 acres along the Miles River near downtown St. Michaels, Maryland. Before it was turned into a museum, this part of the waterfront was an engine of industry, with seafood packing houses, docks, and workboats gliding in and out. The space has been spruced up quite a bit, but still evinces a rustic charm.
Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum's niche is the intersection of nature and culture. We tell stories about the bay, but we always do it with a humanistic slant.
One of those stories is about a species of fish that was once central to life in the Chesapeake. Today, the bay is known for crabs and oysters and rockfish, but there was a time, a period of about 200 years in fact, when the American shad was the most valuable fishery in its waters. You can recognize a shad by its metallic body and deeply forked tail. It's a fish that lives in the ocean, but returns to freshwater rivers and streams to spawn in the spring. During these shad runs, it was like one big party on the bay, Lesher told me. Entire communities would gather to roast shad on planks over hickory wood fires. Those days are long in the past. All those years of fishing depleted the shad population, and the construction of dams across many of the region's rivers made survival tougher by blocking access to many of their spawning grounds. During the first half of the 20th century, the annual shad harvest across the Atlantic seaboard plummeted by 75%. With the species already in decline, the remnants of Hurricane Agnes in 1972 delivered a final blow, Lesher told me.
The hurricane dumped, I forget how many trillion gallons of water on the Susquehanna River watershed, bringing with it, as it washed down, of course, tons and tons of sediment.
In Virginia's rivers, researchers found a complete wipeout of the 1972 year class of shad. In 1973 and 1974, the amount of young shad in Maryland was well below normal. The tailspin continued during what turned out to be an unusually wet decade. Hoping to save what they could, fishery managers started to ban catching shad. But the population never recovered. Throughout its East Coast range, shad remain at 1% of their 1890s levels, when they were at peak abundance. Most evidence of the Chesapeake shad industry has faded away, but not completely. Lesher led me outside to a long wooden warehouse. Inside is the museum's collection of small boats. He drew my attention to a stubby boat with a perfectly flat bottom and not a stitch of paint covering any of its wood. That flat bottom kept it from tipping over as its two occupants worked on deck. Its shallow draft allowed fishermen to venture far upstream on the rivers of the eastern shore, where shad could be caught more easily. And there is no console or any other object that can snag or tear a delicate gillnet. Lesher said that this boat may have been built around 1930, but its useful life probably extended into the 1970s. Well, until Agnes anyway. And so Hurricane Agnes comes along, and yeah, it's not that only turning point, but it's part of the demise of vessels and a way of life.
That's right. And so now a boat like this survives just in the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum and not on the shores of the Choptank River in Caroline County.
During this season of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're taking stock of Agnes. This year marks the storm's 50th anniversary, but in many ways, the effects of Agnes are still with us. With each episode, I'm exploring how we're still living in the world Agnes created. People still live with the emotional scars. Communities from Virginia up to New York still bear physical scars, and the Chesapeake Bay still bears environmental scars. We'll talk about why this still matters today and for our future. Today, we're looking at the storm's long-term impacts on life in the Chesapeake Bay, as well as the rivers and streams in its 64,000 square mile watershed. The story I'm about to tell is going to flip the script on what we tend to hear about the effects that natural disasters have on nature. You know these stories. A massive wildfire chars everything in its path, or a storm blows through a national park, snapping trees like toothpicks or whatever. But pretty soon, green shoots sprout from the ravaged earth. The songbirds return. A full comeback is always just right around the next bend. Full disclosure, I've written these stories before, because there's a lot of truth in that narrative. But it's not always the case. After Tropical Storm Agnes, some of the Chesapeake's living things were so devastated that they never returned to their pre-storm health. Often, as in the case of the American shad, nature had a helping hand in destroying itself. Human actions pushed these living things to the edge, and Agnes nudged them over. Or vice versa. Agnes pushed them to the edge, and humans gave the last nudge. We'll talk about what's been lost since Agnes, and what we may yet regain, starting after this quick break. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you in part by Greenfin Studio, a marketing and communication firm focused on coastal, environmental, and social projects. They have helped hundreds of organizations engage new audiences and reach environmental goals. If your organization wants fresh ideas to expand your reach and deliver more effective messages, check them out at greenfinstudio.com. Welcome back. On today's episode of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're examining the lasting environmental toll of Tropical Storm Agnes. Let's go fishing. So we are fly fishing on the Conestoga. What is the benefit of fly fishing versus, I guess, conventional fishing?
Oh, let's try. You're more closely imitating nature. You've got a artificial fly.
Add Crable, fly fishing at dusk on the Conestoga River. We're just outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Nothing's biting, but Crable doesn't seem to mind. Crable covers Pennsylvania for the Chesapeake Bay Journal. He has worked as a journalist in the state for about 4 decades, and he doesn't just cover the environment, he revels in it. He's always showing our staff pictures from his latest hike or hunting expedition. By comparison, fly fishing in the shallow stream 5 minutes from his driveway must be rather tame. But it's new to me.
It's just a little more intimate relationship with the water. I think it's more fun catch them this way.
You're trying to pretend you're a bug.
Yes.
Up to this point this season, we've showered nearly all our attention on the flooding around the Susquehanna River. But let's not forget the smaller rivers and streams around the drainage basin that also experienced historic flooding, like this one.
Now, are you recording?
Yeah.
If I was standing in this spot on June 23rd, 1972, the water would have been 19 feet over top of my head.
All these years later, Crable told me, Agnes still looms large in the collective memory of the lower Susquehanna Valley.
Around these parts, people remember where they were on March 28, 1979, when the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant partially melted down, and they remember what they saw during Tropical Storm Agnes. Here in Lancaster County, Agnes dropped 8.5 inches of rain in a single day on June 15th and 15 inches over 3 days. 10 people died, including a man who got caught in his basement trying to unplug his electric water heater.
And in some ways, the region's landscape still hasn't recovered from Agnes.
And just, one example of how Agnes has changed the landscape. Redhead ducks used to be the primary duck hunted on the lower Susquehanna. After Agnes, it ripped up all the underwater grasses, which they depend on for food. And to this day, it's rare to ever see a redhead duck in the lower Susquehanna. One of my prized possessions is a hand-carved decoy from a local waterfowl hunter that he gave me from the 1960s.
They just moved elsewhere to feed?
Yeah, it's a certain type of grass, and they were prevalent, for hundreds of years here in the Susquehanna, and then the Agnes just totally ripped them all up. They never reestablished themselves, and they still haven't to this day.
This, I would find in my reporting, was a typical story of life after Agnes. The storm delivered a shockwave of fresh water to the tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay and to the bay itself. This shockwave devastated the ecosystem at some basic level, and the consequences rippled their way up the chain of life. Sometimes, the impacts were temporary. After a few seasons, the affected plant or animal would stage a comeback. And sometimes, there would be no comeback. The Agnes effect would be lasting. In this case, Agnes didn't directly drive away the ducks, but they couldn't stick around after the heavy pulses of water destroyed their aquatic feeding grounds. As far as the environment was concerned, Agnes's primary mechanism of destruction wasn't its winds, or even its remarkable rainfall. It was something that you can barely see with the naked eye, but if you multiply its numbers by the trillion, as Agnes did, you can see it from space.
Sediment, it was impressive. I've seen various estimates, but the one that seems to be sort of a consensus is in 5 days in June, the bay got about 40 years worth of sediment.
You could call Tom Horton the spokesman for the Chesapeake Bay. In a career spanning 50 years, he has written countless newspaper stories and columns about the bay, first for the Baltimore Sun, and now for the Bay Journal. He also has written several Chesapeake-themed books and produced several documentaries. You don't want to challenge him to a kayaking race. He may be in his 70s now, but Horton will beat you. To understand why Agnes was so destructive, he told me, you have to start by looking at the last few miles of the Susquehanna River.
Oh yeah, the Conowingo.
10 miles above the Susquehanna's confluence with the Chesapeake lies the Conowingo Dam. It's a hydroelectric dam that produces enough electricity to power the equivalent of 165,000 homes. When it was completed in 1928, it was the nation's largest hydroelectric project after Niagara Falls. During periods of wet weather, operators can shunt excess water. It gushes through a series of floodgates. There are 53 of these gates. The first time all 53 were opened was during the landmark 1936 flood. The second time was, you guessed it, during Agnes. Horton, a cub reporter at the time for The Sun, was dispatched to the scene.
Because the word was they were going to blow it. And they did have, the National Guard had placed explosives.
In fact, the glut of water was pushing the dam almost to its breaking point.
The water was just coming straight through. It just looked, the water coming out wasn't like a waterfall. It was like just square almost, just like chunks of water coming out, just blasting like from a water cannon. And they still didn't know if the dam would hold. And of course they'd evacuated Port Deposit downstream. Yeah, they were, I think, within hours of, if it had kept going up, of blowing a chunk out of the corner. And in fact, when the dust had settled or the water had subsided, they found that the whole northern side of the dam had been moved about 1/4 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch.
Route 1 runs right over the top of the dam, and it offers quite a view. To the south, which is to say toward the Chesapeake Bay, you almost have to squint to see the Susquehanna below you because it's so far down. If you look to the north, you see what appears to be a broad lake, almost right up to the level of the bridge. The contrast in water height between the two sides struck me as unsettling. The side that looks like a lake is actually a 9,000-acre reservoir that was created by the dam's construction. You can think of the area just above the dam as an aquatic traffic jam. All this water on its way down the Susquehanna suddenly slows down. And it isn't just water within this flow. You also have all the particles of grit that have been coming along for the ride. This slowing down effect causes a lot of that sediment to settle to the bottom. So, for much of its first 40-odd years of operation, the Conowingo was acting like a big filter for the Chesapeake Bay. And that was pretty great for life in the bay, until it wasn't. Behind the dam, untold tons of sediment were building up, layer upon layer, a ticking time bomb of pollution. Then along came Agnes.
It scoured Conowingo almost down to the base. And most storms don't start scouring. It takes a massive, massive flow to start scouring that sediment out. But Agnes did it to a degree we've never seen before or since.
But we got decades of pollution all in one fell swoop.
Well, yeah, that was the price was paid all the way downstream, you know.
It's time to introduce an important piece of context. Agnes arrived at a turning point in the Mid-Atlantic's long-term precipitation cycle. Horton happens to have a chart in a frame inside his house to illustrate the point, because, of course he does.
If you look at this U.S. Geological Survey graph that shows total river flow entering the Chesapeake Bay, what you see is from the mid-50s on through 1972. It was incredibly dry. For like 15, 16 years before Agnes, we had hardly an above-average year and the drought of record.
Starting with Agnes, you can see the line shoot way up and stay up for the next decade.
I mean, look on through the 70s into the 80s. Most of the years were above average. So I guess the point is, yeah, Agnes was a doozy, but there was some bigger picture stuff going on that was maybe even more unusual.
The bay's downfall was never entirely Agnes's fault, Horton told me. The problem was, well, us. We're the ones who cut down the forests and made it easier for sediment to run off into the bay. We're the ones who put down too much fertilizer on our crops and our yards, overloading the landscape with nutrients. And we're the ones who kept building bigger and denser cities, multiplying the number of toilets flushing indirectly into the bay.
And I think it's a mistake to say that as if without Agnes they'd have all been fine to today. I think they wouldn't have been. I think Agnes pulled the trigger on a lot of sins, like all the paving we'd been doing, all the destruction of wetlands, all the ditching on agricultural lands, all the intensive use of fertilizers.
So Agnes unleashed all these years, if not decades, of pent-up pollution into the Chesapeake Bay. And if that wasn't bad enough, it arrived, from an ecological point of view, at perhaps the worst time of year.
The term perfect storm was not in the language back then. The book had not been written, but it really was, in a perverse way, a perfect storm to damage the bay, because it occurred in June when things were flowering, things were spawning, things were migrating. It was a pretty vulnerable time. Maybe less damage would have been done in the winter time.
Well, all that was 50 years ago. Surely nature has healed itself by now, right? As unbelievable as it sounds, some of Agnes's environmental damage is still plenty visible.
Yeah, we'll pick up a little speed, but once we get around the corner.
Hey, where are we here?
So this is Haverty Grace. We are heading south out of the Haverty Grace City Yacht Basin or City Park, however you want to refer to it.
I've hitched a ride on a boat with Pat Depkin. He works in the permitting division of the Maryland Department of the Environment, but he's out here on this day as a native of this part of the bay and as a fan of spending time outdoors here. We're at the very tippy top of the Chesapeake Bay. From here, it's 200 miles to the Atlantic Ocean. We're heading south, but not nearly that far. Our destination is a tiny island in the mouth of a creek on the western shore of the bay. His grandparents used to own the island, and Depkin spent a lot of time there as a kid.
Growing up, it was always kind of weird because we would come down to the marina here with bags of groceries, lawnmower, and as a little kid, I had no concept. I'm like, well, where all these other boats must have somewhere to go.
Agnes's environmental legacy is defined as much by what you don't see as what you do see. And the first thing you notice in this part of the bay is all the underwater greenery. The water is like glass. It's so clean and clear.
I mean, oh, look at that. It's beautiful. Look how clear it is. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah, very thick aquatic grass we're looking at here. Big strands of green right at the surface.
And a variety of species, too. I'm not up on my marine grass taxonomy, but I believe that we've got eelgrass, and I'm not sure what the other stuff is. It kind of looks like broccoli.
This is the Susquehanna Flats. It's the largest single colony of underwater grass in the Maryland portion of the bay. Fishing folk flock here regularly because the fishing is that good. As far as the bay restoration goes, the flats are a kind of bellwether. Aquatic grasses like these are vitally important for restoring the bay because the plants help pump oxygen into the water, improve water clarity, and take up excess nutrients. The Susquehanna Flats were already in decline in the years leading up to Agnes. Worsening water quality was fueling more algae blooms. Those blooms block sunlight and rob oxygen from underwater plants, killing them. After Agnes, the deluge of brown water ran for weeks, inundating the flats with sediment. By the 1980s, the flats still only spread across about 5,000 acres, and the coverage was sparse. But in the early 2000s, the grasses here suddenly started coming back. The most recent survey plotted more than 10,000 acres of vegetation. Scientists with the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science attribute the rebound to modest improvements in water quality, as well as an extended period of dry weather that gave the grasses a break from storm destruction.
It's a pretty good story. I mean, it's not perfect, and we're never going to get back to pre-Columbian conditions. The land side just won't ever permit it. There's just too much development, too much imperviousness. But yeah, this is good. And like I said, the summers that I was coming out here after Agnes, up until the mid-'80s, none of this existed.
Elsewhere in the bay and in the lower reaches of its tributaries, underwater grasses have recovered somewhat since Agnes, but not nearly all the way.
The grasses were hit hard. And, looking back at the declines that began to become evident in the bay around that time, like the decline in seagrasses, I think we'd have seen that even without Agnes, but I think Agnes probably hastened it.
Depkin steered his boat into the mouth of a waterway called Swan Creek. Ahead lay the tree-covered island of his youth, but there was something missing.
There's no grass in here. There ought to be grass here with the water depth as it is. Now, I can't say why. It may be a matter of just the seeds or whatever can't get back here. But I remember there being grass when I was a kid. Not as thick as we saw out in the main flats area, but it was here.
Underwater grasses were only one part of the environmental disaster set in motion by Agnes. There's more after this break.
Hi, this is Laura Lutz, editor at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. I hope you're enjoying our podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join the community of Bay Journal readers. If you care about climate change, wildlife, clean air, healthy communities, and of course the Bay and its rivers, you'll find news you can use at the Bay Journal, along with some great ideas for outdoor travel. Our subscriptions are free. Check us out at bayjournal.com and click on subscribe to start receiving the best independent environmental news in the Bay region.
Hello again. We're exploring the ways that Tropical Storm Agnes still haunts the Chesapeake Bay and its watershed. This wasn't a case of nature acting alone. We humans created the conditions to make Agnes even worse for the environment. Oysters and crabs certainly took a hit during and after the storm, but you can still walk into a restaurant and order a dozen Chesapeake oysters on the half shell, with a crab cake thrown in for good measure. But if you want a soft-shell clam harvested from Maryland waters, good luck. I'm turning here to Ram Lipschitz, a longtime researcher with the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. He is one of the region's biggest shellfish experts. His interest in soft-shell clams was sparked, he told me, when he stumbled upon data for clam catches in Maryland back in the 1990s.
And what that data showed was basically that there was high abundance up until 72. And then in 72, soft-shell clam landings plunged. They dropped by 2/3. And the interesting thing is that, remember this was the 90s, that they had never recovered.
The thinking goes that an unusually large barrage of sediment from Agnes buried the soft-shell clams. They couldn't reposition themselves to regain access to the water column and got smothered. That wasn't the end of the story. Over the years, disease took its toll on the species, also known as steamers or long-neck clams. Scientists also suspect that blue crabs ate more than their fair share of young soft-shell clams as their own numbers perked back up. So what happened is Agnes essentially knocked the clams down, but other forces have kept them down. I wondered about this several times as I worked on this episode. How much do you blame Agnes for the decline of an organism, and how much do you place on other factors? You have to keep in mind that Agnes upended the Chesapeake's ecosystem at a time when pollution controls were still in their infancy, and fishing regulations were patchy at best. Take oysters. Agnes pummeled the bay's oyster population with 30 million tons of sediment. The bivalves certainly suffered in the short term, and in some places, those losses persisted, Horton said.
I think there are some areas of the Potomac River where large beds of oysters were smothered, and I don't know that they've ever come back there.
But the start of the oyster's decline predated Agnes by nearly a century. The culprits? Disease, overfishing, and declining water quality.
I think it's hard to single out Agnes because that whole decade was so wet, because so many of these declines were already set in motion by stuff we had been doing on the land for decades. We were just doing it more intensively, in my own mind.
At the very least, I think we can say Agnes amplified the oyster's problems. Today, even with conservation efforts, such as strict bushel limits and sanctuaries, the oyster's population remains at about 1% of its late 1800s peak. For nearly 40 years, the states within the Bay watershed and the federal government have been trying to restore the estuary's health. It has cost a lot of political capital, not to mention billions of dollars. There have been some reductions in pollution, but a lot more work needs to be done. And Horton, one of the Bay's most vociferous defenders, worries that all it will take is another Agnes-like storm to wipe out those gains.
This is a question I have posed to people. Did we learn anything from Agnes? And another way to put that is, if Agnes happened today, would it be worse for the Bay or not as bad? And I think the answer is it would be worse, because we've continued to develop and we've continued to pave, and the watershed, let's say everything else is equal, it happens again in June, it's the same amount of rain. If anything, plants and animals in the Bay are under more stress, partly from climate change now, than they were in 72, less healthy. The watershed is more paved, And that's true in Maryland and Central Virginia, maybe not so true up the Susquehanna. Maybe that wouldn't be too much different, although I guarantee you it would flush a lot more nutrients out of Pennsylvania now than it did in 72. Probably.
As I spoke with Rom Lipschitz, I could sense the wheels were turning on his end. Our conversation, he said, had got him thinking that there should be a scientific paper that pulls together the long-term impacts of Agnes. Something to serve as a reminder that, in some ways, we're still living in a world shaped by a single storm.
Given that it's 50 years later and that we still see some of these alterations that have persisted. And so we're actually going to work up all this data and so on and try to publish it. And so this has been a great little stimulus on your part, Jeremy, to get us going on that, because a lot of it is faded, is the historical baseline shifts where we get used to something and we think this is the way it is. And this is the way it's always been. And that's just not the case.
Greenfin Studio combines creative design, strategic marketing, and scientific expertise to deliver for our clients. Visit greenfinstudio.com to view their portfolio and ask them how they can help you. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you by the Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental news in the Chesapeake region. Production for this episode was by me, Jeremy Cox. The story was edited by Laura Lutz. Our marketing and advertising director is Jackie Kane. You can find more episodes of Chesapeake Uncharted on your favorite streaming service or at ChesapeakeUncharted.com. If you like what you're hearing, sign up for a free Bay Journal news subscription at BayJournal.com. Until next time, this has been Jeremy Cox. Take care.